I'm Smita Nair. This is your weekly fix. In the sphere of what can be called family matters, marriage, divorce, succession, inheritance, adoption, India practices legal pluralism. These are religion based personal laws. Now, many aspects of personal law are undeniably at odds with gender equality. But the majoritarian push for a uniform civil code to be made applicable to all religious communities in such matters in India isn't simply a matter of working towards ending those inequities. But of course, this is a matter of debate. Last week, the Supreme Court asked the center to make its stand clear within 3 weeks on the feasibility of implementing of a uniform civil code in the country. Now, a new work of scholarship, Divorce and Democracy, explores the interplay between law, religion, family, minority rights, and gender in Indian politics. It's written by Soumya Saxena, a legal historian. Dr. Saxena's focuses on family, law, gender, and religion. She is presently a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the Faculty of History, University of Cambridge. She also served the 21st Law Commission of India as consultant. Thank you for agreeing for speaking to us here at Scroll, Dr. Saxena.
Thank you for your interest in the book, Smita.
Right. So I'm going to begin by asking you to help us understand the lay of the land. Now, even among the better informed, there appears to be some confusion, particularly over the following. One, that since personal laws governing marriage, divorce, inheritance, adoption, etc., draw their authority from religion, they are immutable. Second, what do we really understand when we say codified and uncodified personal law? And the third one has been pointed out by some journalists as well about, entry 5, list 3, which is the concurrent list, gives powers to the state to regulate matters that are governed by personal law. What does that actually mean?
Right. So I'll go one by one. The answer to the first would be that is it immutable? I don't think so. I think it's only the people who have authority over interpreting religion. It's in their interest to attribute a lot of immutability to personal laws. But even if one were to open up the whole, context of religious law, there are histories of how Sharia was not meant to be something that is unquestioned. There are literatures on ijtihad, which within Islam is a concept of debate through which laws evolve. Even in actual adjudication of Muslim personal law, which is outside the legal realm, outside the judicial realm in India, there's a series of ways in which you could adjudicate it. The first one would be to look to the Quran. If you didn't find clarity in it, then you look to the Hadith, which is drawn from the life of the Prophet. Then there is Qiyas, then there is Ijma, and the last two entail a fair amount of consultations with people. So I don't think religious text in itself claims immutability. Similar, history with Hindu personal law as well. There are histories and legacies of Shastras which used to take place. So it wasn't really ever meant to be this immutable law, and which is why codification is such a live exercise, and which is why it continues to take place. So neither constitutional law nor religious law, I don't think either of them are claiming immutability. The second question you asked was about the difference between codified and uncodified law. So in India, we have partially codified almost, family laws of all religious denominations, but not completely. So even though Hindu law, one would believe, has many aspects of it codified, it still leaves tremendous room for maneuver because it recognizes regional differences, it recognizes custom. There are aspects of Hindu custom which are uncodified. Muslim law has also seen a relatively limited codification, but certain aspects of it, such as maintenance upon divorce, has been codified. Also, for instance, the 1939 Act, which is the Dissolution of Muslim Marriages Act, actually lays down a judicial procedure for women to access divorce. There was the Sharia Application Act, which is actually not exactly trying to codify Muslim personal law. It simply says that on matters of divorce, adoption, succession, all matters of family law, the Sharia should be looked to, or Muslim personal law is different from what India has otherwise. And therefore, even the Sharia Application Act doesn't quite codify Muslim personal law. And it's the same with Christian personal law. There are a fair amount of exceptions and recognition of customs, but certain aspects of marriage, divorce, succession, adoption, minority guardianship have been codified. So it's partially codified and partially not. The final question you ask about entry 5 of the concurrent list. Now, this simply means that the states can actually deal with personal law. They can intervene in it so long as what their intervention does not contravene the central statute. And there are multiple examples of this in the book as well, because one interesting one I'll point out because I don't want too much time for one question. But a really interesting example was how in Christian law, it was the UP government which first looked to do away with the fact that a Christian divorce needed to be confirmed by a high court bench. So when they got rid of, this particular idea that divorces will take so long and they need to be confirmed by a bench, they received presidential assent for this legislation. And subsequently, there was a national legislation which also recognized that this was an important thing to do. So very often you would find the state tweaking some aspect of personal law because it works for them locally. And then that is subsequently incorporated in the national legislation, or the president can also deny assent. The idea basically is that it shouldn't contravene a central statute.
Okay, got it. Now, if we can sort of go to the beginning, how did our early lawmakers, makers of our constitution, our constituent assembly, view the role of the state as an agent of modernization and of social reform, particularly with respect to women's rights or lack thereof in the personal sphere? And how did this sort of square off with the commitment to constitutionally guarantee freedom of religion?
This is a really interesting question because, as a historian, we tend to put almost all debates in a global historical context as well. So in the case of, Constituent Assembly debates, where a lot of these questions that you just mentioned are being debated, this is operating not just in a context of, post-partition countries where religious tensions are still very high, and the idea of, Muslim identity is kind of just restricted to the idea of personal law, because in every other realm, be it separate directorates, they're done away with. So there is no separateness that is left to communities except in the limited realm of family law. But we also have to remember that this is they're not just internal factors that are affecting Constituent Assembly debates, but actually global factors as well, because there is this entire period of late 1940s, early 50s is also the period of decolonization. So the Indian state and the lawmakers are kind of dually pressured to create this modern nation state, which is very aspirational, which is talking about a uniform civil code, it is talking about universal adult franchise, but it's also quite concerned about not making indigenous tradition look bad. Because the idea here is that sure, there should be social legislation, but we're also dealing with a colonial legacy. We're also coming of our own. And in this sense, the global context is so important that internationally, Nehru is talking about the non-aligned movement. The global Cold War is taking place. So India's foreign policy is emerging as distinct. So there are lots of pressures on the state to modernize, but also not stigmatize everything that might be termed as quintessentially Indian. Now, this leads me to the final bit of your question about how do they deal with the question of freedom of religion, particularly in a context where there is insufficient representation of women. So whether the question of women's rights really squares with with the idea of religious freedom is not too clear, because these two conversations are not had in a very connected context. On the one hand, you have very few women present in Constituent Assembly. They're concerned with much else other than just freedom of religion. There is the huge problem of abducted women post-partition. So there are women from India who've been taken to Pakistan. They're trying to be reunited with their families. Same from the other side of the border. There are other concerns, and uniform civil code, freedom of religion is just one of them, right? So there's conversation on education for women, making almost every aspect of welfare, available to women. But at the same time, there is also this conversation on uniform civil code. What I discovered in my research on Constituent Assembly debates is that nobody really knew what a uniform civil code would entail. So even people who are speaking in favor of it, they think of it as something very aspirational, and they think of it as something that modern nation states should have. But a lot of them are under the impression that the uniform civil code will coexist with personal laws. So the fact that this would replace personal laws or this would directly affect women is only brought up in a very minor context. It's maybe Ambedkar is the one making that link between right to equality and freedom of religion. But not a lot of people who are speaking of uniform civil code and freedom of religion are really concerned with the question of women, if one could put it that way.
Right. Interesting. And now, in the introduction, in your book, the introduction kicks off with a quote from Uma Nehru, and a question she asked N.C. Chatterjee and Nandlal Sharma in the Lok Sabha during the debate on the Hindu marriage bill in 1955, I'm referring to. She asks, why do you get afraid the moment divorce is mentioned? What do you think your women will leave their homes and run to courts? Now, our viewers may know that the Hindu Code Bill, as envisaged originally as a civil code that will replace Hindu personal law, couldn't go through due to strident opposition. It was subsequently broken down into 3 different bills: the Hindu marriage bill, the Hindu adoption and maintenance bill, and the Hindu succession bill. Dr. Saxena, my question to you is, one, I have to tell you that I was although I've read like bits and pieces of the Constituent Assembly debate on other matters, I haven't quite read enough on this, and it was rather infuriating to look at the sort of deeply sexist remarks made by many of the members there. But my question, to focus on what I'm asking, is, have these sort of bills that I'm referring to that look to reform Hindu personal law, have they substantially reduced gender inequities in the personal space? How much of what was originally envisaged was watered down? And is it a fair claim that thanks to these reforms, Hindu personal law is much more in tune with or aligned to the fundamental right to equality as guaranteed in the Constitution when compared to other religions?
That's a great question, because, I kind of share your, rage over what I discovered when I started reading about the Hindu Code Bill. Because when I started writing this book, I was actually focusing on more contemporary moments. So I was looking at the Hindu Code Bill from the lens of how the Towards Equality report in the 1970s speaks of it. And that report actually speaks quite highly of how, great it is that Hindu law has been codified. And then I picked up the actual Lok Sabha debates, which inform you about the conversation that took place to make this legislation. And it was deeply disappointing because I picked up on so much sexism in the debate. And it's interesting that you also mentioned that much of it was watered down. So it was actually in the 1940s when we first start debating this Hindu Law Committee that's formed. It's also known as the B.N. Rao Committee because he's the one chairing it at that point in time. And there was a lot of correspondence between this committee and All India Women's Conference and the women's organizations that were active in late 1940s. So in one sense, it was a very hopeful legislation, and especially once Ambedkar begins to chair the Hindu Law Commission, what he was suggesting as a Hindu Code Bill, which was a composite act which dealt with all of these subjects together, was undeniably the whole was greater than the sum of its parts. So what we have, the 4 different watered down bills, are much, much less, promising than what Ambedkar had originally envisaged. And I say this because there were certain aspects of, let's say, marriage, if they are sort of separated from succession, it would take away the collective force of the legislation. I say that because, for instance, there were some in Parliament who were speaking about how let's not really link marriage with succession because women are also getting access to matrimonial property after they get married. And we all know that in practice, women don't really get to access marital property, especially back in the 1950s. So unclubbing succession from marriage was a huge flaw, and that it should have never happened. Right. Similarly, I'm coupling a lot of these things, the idea of, whether women inherit from something like adoption. Now, adoption was, again, encouraged in the Hindu scriptures if one didn't have a male progeny. And one wanted a male progeny very often because women didn't inherit. And women were sort of, relegated to a different household upon marriage. So if they were guaranteed succession laws, then perhaps this whole obsession with male progeny could have also been addressed. But this kind of watering down was precisely what upset Ambedkar enough for him to actually submit his resignation. So the Hindu Marriages Act and the Hindu Succession and Act and Inheritance and Adoption, Minority Guardianship, all of these four legislations that were subsequently produced were basically then steered by Nehru because Ambedkar was kind of exhausted with this repeated emphasis on watering down the bills. Now, having said that, whether it does align, whether the existing law does align it a little better with fundamental rights, does it bring benefits to women? I would have to agree because in one sense, even though, this is a very sexist context in which it operates. You might have come across some of the speeches that I speak of. There are particular figures, women figures in parliament who really challenge patriarchy, and they say some really important bombastic statements like Subhadra Joshi actually says that women should rewrite the Shastras. Now, she was one voice in parliament that was very brutally shunned because a lot of what she said needed to be expunged because they considered it too radical, and she was subject to a lot of mockery. Other women who questioned a lot of ideas rooted in religious patriarchy were also subject to a similar kind of anger in parliament. But at the same time, the fact that these voices found space, the fact that these were recorded, the fact that I as a researcher could access them in a written archive also means that putting down a legislation, whatever its, the means could have been, the end result actually put in a lot of existing hierarchies in black letter. Right. And once it was put in form of a legislation, women didn't have to necessarily keep laboring the idea that, this is rooted from Brahminical patriarchy. They could instead just pick up a provision and say, look, there's a problem with this provision. And we want to challenge this in court rather than having to convince an entire society of the fact that this hierarchy exists and this hierarchy doesn't benefit women. One could simply challenge a provision of the act. So just making that inequality visible does open the door for future aligning of that legislation with fundamental rights more closely. I say that also because, for instance, something like dowry was not immediately criminalized when the Hindu Code Bill is being debated. And a lot of men in parliament made the argument that actually dowry is women's right in father's property, so on and so forth. But the fact that it was taking such an evil tone was acknowledged much later when the law against dowry is strengthened and so on and so forth, right? So to that extent, this modularity that the Hindu Code created, however flawed the legislation might be, still put in place certain mechanisms through which women could bring in more challenges legally or outside the law. For instance, the fact that Hindu Succession Act codified inheritance to women in 2005, we have a law recognizing them as co-parceners, which didn't happen back in 1955, but it laid down a law that could subsequently be challenged and amended. So it made religion amendable. And to that extent, I see it as a positive endeavor because it A, recorded women's radical voices on the subject, and B, opened the door for religion to become completely amendable and open to challenge.
Right. And the last part of that question, while putting it on the record that it was the Hindu right that vociferously objected to the Hindu Code Bill and the subsequent sort of iterations that came before different bills, as you refer to, putting that on the record for the moment, but asking you the question again, do these, or is it even a fair sort of comparison to make, that do these amendments therefore bring Hindu personal law perhaps more in alignment with gender equity as compared to other major religions practiced in the country, or is that an unfair question because it would perhaps...
I would hesitate in making that conclusion immediately because Hindu law at this point also needed a lot of amendment. We have to remember that certain religions, Islam for instance, this is not to pitch one religion against the other, but codification of Islamic law did start in 1930s. It preceded Hindu Code Bill. In some sense, Islam also already recognized women's access to succession and access to inheritance. So this is not to say, see how it currently stands, the Hindu codified version of Hindu Code could possibly is better aligned with fundamental rights. But whether Hindu law per se was always historically better aligned would be something I would hesitate to conclude. Because a lot of these religions, we can say that, true, it's not seen a lot of codification in terms of Islam, but the fact that it's seen a lot of judicial intervention also contributes to making religion, interpretable in a certain way. So if the parliament is not engaged in the act of converting Islamic law into statute to sort of make it subject to fundamental rights, the Indian courts have been quite vociferously engaged in it. But to simply answer that question, codification of Hindu law was a deeply significant moment. I mean, that I wouldn't take away from the bill. However, it might have crystallized, and it certainly did, Brahminical privilege. It also was a very significant moment from which women then subsequently really started to campaign against a whole bunch of practices within Hinduism, because it became something, it was rendered amendable through this law.
Right, and we have Dr. Ambedkar, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, and a bunch of women lawmakers in particular to thank for that. Dr. Saxena, your book covers the spectrum of personal law. Why then did you choose to name your book Divorce in Democracy in particular?
So I don't deal sufficiently with succession and inheritance, and I touch upon adoption, but I do think that debate is far deeper. I became more interested in the question of marriage and divorce also because of where contemporary politics on the subject was at that point in time. The country was kind of really obsessing with triple talaq. This was also the time when the Supreme Court actually said that in terms of mutual consent divorce, women don't have to wait they can waive the 6-month waiting period. So this was a very active time for marriage and divorce law. And to me, it seemed like a lot of the controversial questions were emerging around the subject of divorce, because inheritance has seen multiple law commission reports. It's also seen multiple amendments in parliament. But divorce is something that literally riled up so many people, and religious organizations, the court and parliament are confronting each other. So that made divorce a very interesting lens through which I could understand Indian democracy. And it also ties in to democracy in a very different way, because I think it was Joan Walsh Scott who first made the comparison between divorce and democracy. And she says that it was a way, both of these ideas were basically a way of granting the weaker a power to challenge the authority. And in some sense, the wife is in a position to challenge her husband's authority through divorce. And that made it a really interesting lens, not just for studying gender, but also democracy more generally, and minority politics, because it appears that when we speak of divorce, immediately the question of is it Hindu personal law, is it Muslim personal law, which is better, where are we at with both, that completely tends to consume that conversation. And strangely enough, even when we speak of uniform civil code, if such a code were to come to be, Hindu inheritance systems such as the Hindu undivided family would also be deeply affected. But nobody seems to care about it so long as Muslim divorce is done away with, right? So somehow the controversy tends to accrue around divorce, and hence my interest in that subject and trying to look at democracy through that.
Right. Now, in the chapter Personal Law and the Making of Modern Religion, you provide extracts, as I said earlier, from the Lok Sabha debate on the subject of divorce. There are 2 lines that I thought sort of succinctly speak to the nature of the debates. You write, and I'm reading here, Parliament characterized practices unfamiliar to the North Indian upper caste as immoral. This laid the ground for yet another civilizational battle, which followed each clause that did not sit well with the dominant morality of the North Indian Hindu upper caste male. Who won the day, in your opinion? Was it the traditionalists or the reformers?
So there is a lot of post-colonial scholarship on how these ideas of reform that informed the initial zeal of making of nation states basically ended up reforming things, but ultimately reinforcing existing hierarchies and basically just giving a new name to old hierarchies and old forms of domination. This was something that also happened with the Hindu Code Bill, because it did crystallize Brahminical privilege. And I say this also because it upset Ambedkar enough to actually quit the assembly at this moment, quit the Congress at this moment, because in some sense it was just impossible to unsee the way in which customs like regional customs, for instance, among the Nayars, let's say if there is uncle and niece marriages, these were termed as marriages that are against Hindu morality. And there are lots of pleas even in the Hindu Code Bill debate, where there are members who get up and says, look, you have to look beyond the Vindhyas when you are actually codifying a law like this. There is almost no engagement with the fact that the Northeast will not be touched even by the Hindu Code Bill, right? So in one sense, it creates a very modular code, which only gets better with time, is what I am trying to argue. In its initial form, it wasn't so clear cut at all. I mean, it did not even recognize women as Kopasanas. So it definitely crystallized male privilege, and women also began to challenge it in a lot of ways, because anything that they would recommend that North Indian upper caste male would think does not sit well with them, they would say, why don't you put this in the Special Marriage Act? Why do you want a religious prefix for something that is, inherently immoral? And that is Special Marriage Act is, the Special Marriage Act has already been debated because that's in 1954. So in the Special Marriage Act, their problem was that, oh no, if we introduce diversity of customary practice, we won't be able to create a neutral legislation. Therefore, cross-cousin marriages should not make it into the Special Marriage Act. It should also not make it into the Hindu Marriage Act, because Hindu morality here is completely determined by the North Indian upper caste male. Now, having said that, there is a reason why I have a slightly positive view of everything that came out of the Hindu Code Bill ultimately. It's because, to some extent, because of the Nehruvian stamp that this bill had, it never quite became something that Hindu nationalists could appropriate. I say that because the Hindu supremacists at this point are actually in opposition of the bill, and the bill still comes into being. So it had potential to not just crystallize Brahminical patriarchy, but also perpetuate it, also completely empower the upper castes in perpetuity. But the upper castes, some of them were so extreme that they were against any kind of meddling with Hindu personal law to begin with. And what this Hindu Code Bill does is, regardless of the debate that's taking place in Parliament, that you and I will be able to discover when we actually look at the text of parliamentary debates, the legislation that was ultimately produced is so difficult to pin into any religious tenet. It's almost impossible to find it's linked to the sacred, it's linked to the divine. And while we can see that some sense of, Hindu morality is clearly driving it, it's not very easy to call it something that's been derived out of the Shastra or something that's been derived out of Manusmriti, because the rhetoric here really is that Ambedkar is the modern Manu, Ambedkar is rewriting the Manusmriti. So that discarding of the Manusmriti, even though it wasn't quite done, the fact that so many people are talking about discarding it in itself was an important moment. So to that extent, I think showed the traditionalists won. Technically, they did win, because the legislation as it came out did not necessarily include caste customs. It still made divorce very, very difficult for Hindu women, which isn't the case across the spectrum, across castes in India. Yet we have a very difficult divorce procedure. But having said that, the actual upper caste Hindu male figure himself was so disappointed with the bill that it gives us some hope that they didn't quite feel like their privilege was crystallized in any way. And that's why I think in the years to come, Hindu law was subject to challenge. It continues to be. We saw the Sabrimala case. Now, through a lot of these laws, I mean, I, as a historian and not somebody who's reading history only through the law, I'm very skeptical and I'm very conscious of the limits of the law. So I don't think any law completely revolutionizes any social movement. It doesn't really change anything. It doesn't really grant women what they're originally asking for. But nonetheless, I think what the book shows is that it kind of encourages a dialogue on divorce, a dialogue on patriarchy, a dialogue on discarding the Manusmriti. And that in itself, I think, is an important aspect of the law. It's only to that extent that the law is useful. And therefore, to that extent, I think while the traditionalists may have won, they did not manage to sustain privilege through the law for too long. And I mean, clearly, socially, they still carry that privilege, and it's been extremely difficult to undo, despite protections through the constitution and ban on undisability and the SC/ST Act. That privilege is extremely difficult to dismantle. But the Hindu traditionalist disappointment with the Hindu Code Bill makes me feel like it couldn't quite be appropriated by them in time.
Right. Superb. Dr. Saxena, there's a widely held belief here that there were no state-led attempts in independent India to reform, modify, codify, amend Muslim and Christian family laws. To what extent is that true, or is it true at all?
I love that you asked this question because you said the word attempt. So I'm not saying that there were successful attempts, but there were actually multiple state-led attempts to deal with the question of personal law, which is why I think that democracy is so preoccupied with personal law. I can actually start with examples itself. So immediately after independence in the 1960s itself, Nehru attempted to have a Muslim code bill. He set up a committee. He appointed members to actually start a conversation on codifying Muslim personal law. This didn't come through, so it was an unsuccessful state-led attempt. In 1961, they tried to amend Christian personal law, and this amendment was also in form of two different reports that came out in 61 and 62, and both of them dealt with Christian matrimonial clauses. And it recognized custom, it recognized diversity, it recognized the different sects of Christianity within the country. It had a whole bunch of amendments, some of which came through in 1969, but the bill lapsed. And then these reports were basically taken up again in 2001. And these are just legislative attempts, right? Even with Muslim personal law, for instance, there is, of course, post-independence, there was an attempt in 1949 to amend an aspect of Muslim marriages. There was, of course, the 1986 Act, post-Shah Bano, which is the Muslim Women's Protection of Rights on Divorce Act. There was the Waqf Act in 1995. In, again, 2019, you have the Muslim Marriages Protection of Rights on Marriage Act. But the important point that I want to make here is that we shouldn't just look at state-led, we shouldn't just look at legislature-led attempts, because state is also constituted by, other functionaries such as the judiciary. So the judiciary has made multiple attempts to actually align a lot of personal law with fundamental rights and with a whole bunch of other aspects of the Indian Constitution. It has frequently tested every statutory law that was enacted, such as the Muslim Women's Protection of Rights on Divorce Act, which was enacted in 1986. In the Daniel Latifi case, it gets reinterpreted. So actually, the state is trying to deal with personal law in very different ways. And the same applies for the Law Commission. The Law Commission has dealt with the question of Hindu inheritance over and over and over again. It has also dealt with bigamy within Islam. It has also dealt with converts marriage bills, so on and so forth. So actually, there have been various attempts. They've met with limited success. Even in the case of Christian law, so of course 2001 was the big moment where divorce law was amended. But also in 1960s, there were organizations that were quite active in either opposing the idea of amendments or proposing all new sorts of ideas. But it would be incorrect for me as a historian to say that there were no attempts. So they may not have been as successful, but the state has been engaged with the question of personal law multiple times. And why only look at these agencies? We should look at the Sachar Committee report, right, which came out in 2004, which is basically just telling us about the status of Muslims in India, but it deals with Muslim personal law in a very significant chapter as part of that report. So the state is engaged with personal law, and it isn't just something that that happens because one particular political party has it in its electoral agenda to bring a uniform civil code. Actually, codification of personal law as an administrative convenience as well as a matter of women's rights has been dealt with repeatedly. And yeah, it's the same with Special Marriages Act. It's the same with a lot of customary laws as well. So I wouldn't say that it's not been dealt with at all.
Okay. If we could look at more recent debates on the subject of reforming personal law, in your book you write, in some sense, the very turn to religious feminism in the past 2 decades, particularly for minority religions in India, can be mapped onto historical processes and events such as the rise of religious nationalism and or judicial activism, which impacted women's relationship with the law. Now, for those who are not entirely conversant with religious feminism, could you perhaps illustrate with examples what you mean by the turn to religious feminism and how is it connected to the events that you referred to?
Right. So I'll first talk about how religious feminism and secular feminism can be mapped onto historical processes. So the reason I say that is because, let's say, immediately post the Shahbano controversy, women are faced with a very unfair choice of either choosing to go for this very abstract notion of a uniform civil code, which is also being promised to them by a political establishment, which is extremely involved in structure of the Babri Mosque and the conversation around that, because the twin agendas in 1980s for the newly formed BJP are reconstruction of a temple in place of the Babri Mosque and a uniform civil code. Now, on the opposite end, you have the Muslim Personal Law Board, which is a very male-dominated clergy, which is speaking about protection of the Babri Mosque. They're all members of the Babri Masjid Action Committee, and they're speaking about the inviolability of personal law. So only Muslim women are having to make this unfair choice of choosing their identity under threat or choosing an abstract set of rights. Now, post Shahbano, this debate tends to change a little bit, because Uniform Civil Code was an original left position where they wanted to instill some difference between the state and religion, right? But now, increasingly, because in Uniform Civil Code was becoming, as a part and parcel of the conversation on Hindu nationalism, the women's movement has distanced itself a little bit post 1980s from this idea of uniformity. Now I want to come on to what religious and secular feminism, as I understand it, might be. So, of course, in academia, there would be, let's say, these global categories of religious feminism, which is about reinterpreting religion, giving it a more sort of a feminist interpretation. They work predominantly within the discursive tradition. They would speak about how original interpretations of religious texts are actually far more liberal than its practical aspects, and it's the way in which it works in everyday life. The original interpretation is actually far more women friendly. Secular feminism, on the other hand, would distance itself from this religious trope, and they would say that regardless of whether a right aligns with religion or whether the religious text supports it or not, women's rights are something that need to be negotiated separately, and it need not be within the argument of religious of what religion says at all. In India, these two categories as distinct categories does not hold, because Indian feminism is far more complex and far more interesting than the way this binary opposition between religious and secular feminism as it could have characterized, let's say, the debates in the Middle East or elsewhere. In India, although we have religious feminist movements, the ones that I've used in my book are the Bharatiya Muslim Mahila Andolan, which very openly identifies as a Muslim women's organization, Beba Collective, which culturally identifies as Muslim but does not want to work within the framework of religion. And the BMMA actually claims that it is influenced by this global religious feminist movement called the Musaba, which is basically about reinterpreting religious texts and aligning them with feminist interpretation. In India, however, these lines are not so between religion and secular are not so clearly drawn, because religious feminists are actually very willing to negotiate with the state for legal remedies. And secular feminism, on the other hand, would really point to the problem of Hindu nationalism and the fact that it's leading to marginalization of Muslims, not just in the realm of personal law, but also the general rhetoric of what, of the times we live in right now. And therefore, it occupies almost an opposite position, where religious feminists are negotiating with what is technically a hostile government, and the secular feminists are doing the job of pointing out that, look, this rhetoric of saving Muslim women from Muslim men is not always beneficial. Now, true that these might seem like contradictory positions that these two strands of the women's movement occupies, but in my mind, I actually think this is a productive conversation, because they're tackling two different kinds of patriarchy in two very different realms. Let's say secular feminist organizations, which are actually committed to the idea of women's empowerment, but they're concerned about the fact that Hindu nationalists are appropriating this agenda on uniformity, this agenda on bringing abstract rights to save Muslim women. So they manage to actually keep the state in check by saying that you can't just push for a uniform civil code, arguing that this is actually for women, because women don't really want it. On the other hand, what religious feminists, women who identify as Islamic feminists who operate in India, are using the law to actually target the religious clergy, men who kind of identify or actually are the self-proclaimed sort of custodians of Muslim personal law. They're using or threatening with legal strategies these organizations such as the Muslim Personal Law Board to say that you can't have a monopoly on religious rights, because their argument isn't law versus religion. Their argument is that actually the Quran already gives us these rights, and therefore what we witnessed in Shaira Banu case was women arguing not just that this is constitutionally unsustainable, this idea of triple talaq, but also it is Quranically unsustainable. Even the Quran doesn't approve of this form of divorce. Now, this, of course, has a much longer history. This kind of, alignment of constitution and the Quran, or the Shastras and the constitution. So Indian secularism, or the legal history that we have around religion has done this historically. But the present movement and the present divide in framing resistance in the Indian women's movement actually really plays a productive part in countering patriarchy in two different realms. And therefore, while there may be a strategic difference between religious and secular feminism, this strategic difference might actually bode very well for negotiating with the hostile state as well as the hostile clergy in this case, to challenge them out of their self-proclaimed positions as authorities on religious texts.
You've already answered what was to be my next question. So this is more in as a sort of as a comment. In the course of my reporting, I've interacted with the Bharatiya Muslim Mahila Andolan a number of times. Now I remember this conversation I had perhaps 10 years ago with Dr. Noor Jahan Niaz. The VMMA, as you pointed out, has also been seeking a sort of comprehensive codification of the Sharia. She said, and I'm paraphrasing her here, that the women's movement in India had to a large extent failed to interrogate or even engage with a woman's position inside of religion. And she says that is the lived reality of most women. And that seeking reform within religion has not for a long time been a priority for the women's movement. And she thought there was a sort of a black hole that existed, that a woman shouldn't have to give up her religious identity to enjoy her constitutional rights. On the other hand, as you pointed out as well, secular feminists have been rather uneasy with sort of seeking state intervention, particularly when the state is majoritarian in nature. So that sort of a conflict, we said, is actually good. I'm quickly going to jump to the final couple of questions because we've been talking a while. It's been a fascinating conversation. Law Commission on Uniform Civil Code. When you were a consultant, if you could sort of talk about how you came to the conclusion, how the Law Commission came to the conclusion that perhaps Uniform Civil Code is not the way to go. Because I even remember a group of progressives like Bezwada Wilson, Mukul Kesavan, T.M. Krishna, Nilanjana Roy. They had presented this sort of model PUCC, I think, Progressive Uniform Civil Code to Justice Chauhan. Could you briefly take us through what the conclusion was?
Okay, so one of the most oft-quoted lines from the commission was that the Uniform Civil Code is neither necessary nor desirable. Yes. But the reporting doesn't tend to go beyond it, because the Law Commission had a lot to say on what was instead therefore desirable. And it recommended a whole bunch of things on codifying Muslim inheritance laws, on rethinking the way in which Hindu undivided family works. There was even an argument for actually extending the Hindu undivided family as a tax saving measure to all religions. It also spoke of Parsi women's right to separate legal identity even after divorce, and so on and so forth. There were a whole bunch of complex processes, streamlining adoption law. There was also a conversation on amending basically a whole bunch of things which never get spoken of because A, it's a subject that was so embroiled in controversy, and B, it came out as a consultation paper and not a report, and therefore we couldn't write it in form of an amendment. We could just say that these are the suggestions, but the operative part, which would have been the bill, would have been a part of it if it were a report and not a consultation paper. Now, the subject of Uniform Civil Code, at this point, the context defining it was simply that there was this triple talaq case going on in the Supreme Court. That's 2017 when you have the triple talaq judgment, and even before the report came out on 31st August 2018, the Muslim Women's Protection of Rights on Marriage Bill was already in conversation in Parliament. So in one sense, there was a lot of pressure to respond to that controversy as well. And this also ties in a little bit with the previous question that you asked about our consultations with a lot of women's organizations. Now, sure, this wasn't a very complete consultation process because they could only meet people who directly wrote to the commission and said that we want an audience. And that's why a very limited number of groups and organizations did come up. But whoever came, mostly who represented women, were not necessarily in favor of uniform civil code. So true, this difference between religious feminism and secular feminism was apparent even there, because religious feminist groups came in with model drafts of bills and legislations because they were happy for there to be intervention in personal law so long as it wasn't uniform, so that it wasn't like a deletion of Muslim personal law altogether. But at the same time, the secular organizations such as Saheli, Ali, they had also made their position really clear on the fact that a uniform civil code would not exactly benefit. And there is a lot of merit in that argument as well, because as you've seen the case with the new triple talaq law that Parliament came up with, there are very mixed reactions on whether it's actually benefiting women or not. Because very often increasing like a lot of just producing so much legislation simply increases litigation for women, and they're still unable to really negotiate outcomes favorable to them. So yes, there was this one very interesting draft that came from QCL, which also spoke about the whole idea of a civil partnership, and that would have been very interesting. There was a consultation with Labia. There were lots of organizations which came in which had some very, very good suggestions on what civil partnerships should look like. Unfortunately, one of my regrets also is that it didn't deal with the question of same-sex partnerships, this Law Commission report. Because there was just the context was so controversial that it was very difficult for us to really, come up with it didn't even come up in form of a report. So you can imagine the kind of pressures that operated there. So it was really tough for us to put in a lot of radical ideas. But if someone were to look at the consultations, they would find a very, very rich debate. And I think what the commission ended up concluding towards was a very unified opinion from the women's movement, different strands, against the idea of uniformity, because they were concerned about only the template of a code and the fact that it was coming from a unilateral state, but also the fact that they thought that this would have limited benefits. For instance, an optional civil code does exist in the form of a special marriage act, right? People can opt into it if they want. But Special Marriage Act is so procedurally difficult, and it requires you to declare the marriage. The notice is pinned up. People can come and object to it. Interreligious couples end up going to a different state to marry so that they're not sort of persecuted by their own parents and community. So in that sense, uniformity was not necessarily a guarantee of any sort of empowerment or a greater sort of, a greater amount of leeway in one's choice of partners. And therefore, the commission ended up concluding with this. I think in this entire conversation on personal law, a lot of state institutions have been very careful in the sense the Supreme Court could have also dealt with the unilateral aspect of triple talaq and not just spoken on the simple, speedy delivery of the talaq. And it's a very limited order. It entails a 300-page discussion with a one-line order that triple talaq is now invalid. So in one sense, the Supreme Court could have overturned a judgment like Naras Gopamali. It didn't do that. It kind of really delivered the safest possible order to say that, this particular form of talaq is not included. Similarly, the Law Commission, I think, was very cautious in its recommendations. And despite all the caution they exercised, that report ultimately did come out as a consultation paper, which says a lot also about whether democracy in India is still as dialogic as it was historically was, because we know that Law Commission reports have triggered amendments to rape law in India post the Mathura case. It's brought in, conversations about Hindu women's maintenance and so on and so forth. And to not be able to actually engage with this question when Parliament was debating this bill, to not actually refer to this report is quite concerning, I think, for the health of Indian democracy.
Right. And maybe perhaps as scholars like Faizan Mustafa argue, a sort of piecemeal well-argued piecemeal codification of personal law will be a better answer than looking at sort of uniformity in personal law. I wanted to ask you a question on what Indra Jaising calls the ghost of Narsuappa Mali that haunts the corridors of our courts, and sort of how that has affected how judiciary has viewed. But unfortunately, we're sort of, maybe that's a separate conversation. For the moment, though, Dr. Samit Saxena, I really appreciate your time and your insight and that wonderful work of scholarship that you've produced, Divorce and Democracy.
Thank you so much, Smita. This was a lovely conversation, and thank you for making the time.